Welcome to the first pig of the new year. And after 2 unsuccessful attempts for the last couple of years, we finally have Fridland here. So I'm very pleased, and she's going to talk about do as I say and as I do. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much, and thank you so much for letting me reschedule not once, but twice. I see that with this great turnout, maybe I've built anticipation, so I hope that I don't let you down too much. And thanks so much for organizing, Till. So I'll get right into it. Do as I say and as I do. So one thing that we might notice is that the richness, sophistication, and variety of human culture, our norms, our practices, and our technologies are simply beyond compare in the animal world. And one reason for this richness, one of the reasons that we're able to inhabit this complex and diverse cultural environment is because we're able to build on the skills, knowledge, and innovations of previous generations. That is, our culture is rich, sophisticated, and diverse because it is cumulative. So cumulative culture refers to transmissions via social learning of behavioral changes in a population that accumulate over many generations. And specifically, when we're thinking about cumulative culture, we're not just thinking of sort of an aggregate or a sum of changes, but we're thinking of something that Michael Tomasello has coined the ratchet effect. And that's that our cultural traditions accumulate in a specific way, that is through repeated modifications and improvements. Our traditions are directly transmitted to future generations and result in behaviors that are too complex to have been invented by a single individual. That is, we build on the traditions of past generations. We don't have to start from scratch. We don't have to reinvent the wheel, right? We get our traditions already in improved form from previous generations. And this allows us the kind of rich and sophisticated, complex culture that we as humans enjoy. Now, we should notice that in order to account for cumulative culture, there's at least 2 different principles or 2 different kinds of separate things that we need to explain, right? One of them is going to be the high-fidelity transmission of traditions, right? The transmission of tradition among members of a population. But we also need to explain how it is that those traditions are modified or improved, or how it is that we can innovate. So one thing that is striking is that philosophers and psychologists have often focused on high-fidelity transmission. Right? And so they've thought that this is the thing that we really need to explain. This is the thing that we really need to focus on. These are the cognitive capacities that make this possible. Those are the things that we need to be worried about. And often you'll hear philosophers and psychologists claim that there's 2 mechanisms by which we are able to transmit in a high-fidelity manner our traditions, those mechanisms via imitation and teaching. And it's not sort of accidental that high-fidelity transmission is the focus of theoretical and empirical concern, because there's a couple of reasons to think this is where we really need to think about things. One is that computer modeling has shown us that that high-fidelity transmission is absolutely central to cumulative culture. But another is that it seems that innovation or creativity just sort of abounds in the animal world, right? So it seems as though we can just take it for granted because we see that creativity just sort of is the norm, right? I'm going to say today, what I'll argue is that this approach is misguided, right? So focusing only on high fidelity transmission misses something really important. And it misses something really important because we cannot generalize from the creativity of the animal world to the creativity or the innovativeness of human culture. And that's largely going to be because of the constraints that there are on high fidelity transmission. Right? So for cumulative culture, if we're going to explain both high fidelity transmission and innovation, then innovation has to be of a certain kind. And in order to explain that, what I'll claim then is that we should think of imitation specifically as primarily concerned with high fidelity transmission, and we should think about teaching primarily as our means for, or our mechanism for innovation. Now, that's not to say that both of these cannot be used for high fidelity transmission, but it is to say that if we want to conceptualize properly the function of each, then we should separate the two and what it is that they are for. So I'll also argue, I'll also argue that there's a clear connection between imitation and the kind of teaching that I'll claim is required for cumulative culture, insofar as it exploits what myself and Richard Moore have termed the technique-centric orientation. So I'll argue that once teachers leverage the technique-centric orientation, the possibility to transmit information and skills in both a conservative and a creative manner becomes available. Specifically, in technique-centered pedagogy, focusing on the precise means by which a task is instantiated allows teachers to communicate to students which aspects of a technique are relevant and which are irrelevant. And this kind of teaching can also promote understanding of the underlying nature and significance of the elements composing a task or technique. And in doing this, technique-centered teaching frees the student from the bonds of strict replication that's required for imitation by fostering understanding. So this understanding allows for the variation in technique that is required for cultural innovation, variation that doesn't undermine the high fidelity transmission that's required for cumulative culture. So by focusing on the technique-centered orientation, what we'll see is that we're going to get a clear connection between imitation and teaching, and we'll also find a way to overcome what I'll go into some detail arguing for, which is the conservatism of imitation for high fidelity transmission. So we'll get an explanation of the right kind of innovation for cumulative culture. Okay, so hopefully all of that will become crystal clear through the talk. In the first part of the talk, well, you can see the outline for yourself. That's what I'll be doing today. Okay, so first, let's talk about imitation. One of the things to notice about imitation is that it allows for the learning, for the transmission of particular kinds of skills, knowledge, and information. One kind of phenomenon that I'm concerned with is the transmission of complex skills with an opaque causal structure. Right? So these are skills where the contribution of various elements of the skill cannot be, or they're difficult to understand simply through observation or independent individual reasoning, largely because there's lots of subtasks or sub-goals, and so the way in which various elements contribute to the overall goal or task isn't obvious, right? It's opaque, it has an opaque causal structure. Another kind of phenomenon that I'm interested in explaining here is the transmission of conventional behaviors, right? So imitation allows us to transmit behaviors like norms and rituals and even maybe language, where the particular actions or the particular behaviors are sort of causally arbitrary in terms of the goal, right? So they're causally arbitrary insofar as the reason for the existence of various kinds of tasks isn't there for causal reasons alone, right? They have to be, so you couldn't just by individual reasoning sort of discern why it is that someone was performing the various parts of a task or the various parts of a ritual without understanding in a broader context. So the claim is that imitation is especially suited to explain how it is that complex skills with an opaque causal structure and conventional behaviors are transmitted in a population. But how exactly does it promote this kind of learning? So in a paper in Phil Psych, Richard and I forward this definition of imitation. We say that imitation is the reproduction of an observed behavior where the agent imitating, one, recognizes the behavior of the demonstrator as goal-directed, and two, has some particular interest in or concern for replicating the precise technique performed by the author of the observed action. So I'm not going to say much about that first part. I'm more than happy to discuss why it is that that first criterion is required. But what I'm going to do is focus really on the second criterion of imitation to try and highlight why it is that it can perform the kind of function that we need it to perform for cumulative culture. So I'm going to focus on what we've called the technique-centered orientation. And this is a particular concern for replicating the detailed strategies or nuanced procedures of an observed action, a concern which is not reducible to the instrumental value of the procedure and which is not simply a matter of fortuitously reproducing the observed actions. And I'll basically just go through two studies that I take as especially sort of elegant in demonstrating this technique-centered orientation and what it is that I think is really important about it and why it's relevant for our purposes. So if we look at the literature in comparative and developmental psychology, one thing that becomes striking is that human children are precise but impractical imitators. So that's not to say that children are irrational in their choice of what or whom they imitate, but it is to say that once they have decided to, I'm not here. Once they have decided to imitate, often for at least somewhat rational reasons, children imitate in, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. I thought for sure it was like one of the PhD students. Once children decide to imitate, often for somewhat rational reasons, they imitate in an impractical way. That is, children imitate in a highly detailed manner that does not simply aim to replicate the instrumentally relevant aspects of an observed action strategy. Right? And this impractical orientation, I think, is really nicely illustrated in this 2007 study by Lyons et al., where and this generally is known as overimitation, right? So this is just a phenomenon known as overimitation. There's lots of studies that show that children do this, but I think this is a particularly nice one. So Lyons et al. Present 3 to 5-year-old children with a demonstration of a model or a demonstrator manipulating a novel object, And the demonstration includes a causally irrelevant action in order to, say, get the toy out, right? So like a feather tap to open the jar, for instance. Now, after training children to recognize relevant and irrelevant causal actions, Leon Zettel set out to see how this information, right, how this knowledge would impact imitation. And what's interesting, somewhat surprising, I think, from a naive perspective, is that even after children determined that the feather tap was irrelevant for retrieving the toy out of the object, they continued to incorporate it in the production of their own behavior. And what's more is that children that were better at identifying the causally irrelevant feather tap were no less likely to incorporate it in their behavior. Even after the demonstrators left the room and the children were told to retrieve the toy, they continued to incorporate the irrelevant feather tap. And even when children were told to leave out the silly action or element, right, they continued to over-imitate. They continued to produce the irrelevant feather tap. Now, I think the peculiarity of over-imitation is really sort of highlighted when we compare the behavior of human children to the behavior of non-human primates. And this is because in non-human primates, the kind of impractical orientation towards the details, towards the technique of an action plan that we see in children is almost entirely absent. So Byrne and Rusin put it this way. They say that non-human primates imitate at the program level, but not the action level. So they imitate sort of the substance of the action, the purpose or the sequence of music sort of generally, but not the form or the details of the action. And the distinction between this practical mindset of chimpanzees and this sort of impractical mindset of human children, I think is really nicely demonstrated in Horner and Whiten. So here you have similarly a novel object that children and chimpanzees need to manipulate. So this was with, I think, 2 to 4 year old children and chimpanzees. 3 and 4 year old children in one condition, and with chimpanzees in another. You have an object that you have to manipulate in various ways in order to retrieve a toy or a grape for the chimpanzees. And you have 2 conditions, right? So for both the chimpanzees and for the human children, 2 conditions. One is a transparent condition and one is an opaque condition. In the opaque condition, the observer is not able to see when an action is causally irrelevant. All of the demonstrations included one causally irrelevant action. In the transparent condition, the observer was able to perceive which of the actions was irrelevant for opening the box, right, to manipulate it. Interestingly, what Horner and Whiten found was that chimpanzees reproduced the entire sequence, including the causally irrelevant action, in the opaque condition, so when they could not see that it was irrelevant, but not in the transparent condition. Transparent condition, chimpanzees left out the causally irrelevant action. But in contrast, children reproduce the causally irrelevant movement in both conditions. So once the chimpanzee determined that the action was irrelevant, they no longer incorporate it into their behavioral repertoire. Children, on the other hand, reproduced the causally irrelevant behavior in both the transparent and in the opaque condition. 2 things to notice here. Children were tested separately to see whether they were able to identify which action was relevant and which was not, did fine in that condition. So it wasn't a matter of not being able to see which was causally relevant, which was not. And a further thing to notice is that the fact that chimpanzees reproduced all the action elements of the demonstration in the opaque condition shows us that chimpanzees are capable of somewhat detailed replication or imitation, even if they don't default to this strategy, or even if they're not motivated to use this strategy in all instances. So the point of going through these studies is just to show that sort of together these studies, I mean, I only went through 2, but there's a large literature here that I take these to be representative of. Together, overimitation and the difference between imitation in human and non-human primates helps us to illustrate the peculiarity of human children when it comes to replicating the detailed strategies or techniques of a demonstrated task. And it's exactly this peculiarity that Richard and I attempt to capture in our definition of imitation with the somewhat inelegant term of the technique-centered orientation. What I should emphasize is that for the purposes of this paper and the purposes of this talk, this impractical technique-centered orientation it's very useful for transmitting precisely the kinds of traditions that I highlighted earlier, that is, complex tasks with an opaque causal structure and conventional behaviors that are sort of arbitrary from a causal perspective necessarily. Right, and just to say, the reason that that this is so is that because fully reproducing an observed behavior, in doing this, a novice can take on board the modifications, the improvements, or the innovations directly from the model demonstrating, even when the novice doesn't herself appreciate why those actions or procedures are important. And in this way, one need not reinvent efficiencies on one's own, but rather can incorporate these modifications and improvements of previous generations directly into one's behavioral repertoire. And so the upshot is that humans' apparently impractical orientation in imitation has very practical payoffs when it comes to cumulative culture. So what I'll do in this next section is to argue that if imitation is going to function as a high-fidelity transmission mechanism of the kind that cumulative culture requires, then imitation, by its very nature, has to be conservative. That is, imitation should be in opposition to the innovation and creativity that also appears to be required for cumulative culture. And this is because the modifications that would result from innovation could change the details of a demonstrated behavior, thus jeopardizing the faithful transmission of the tradition. In short, if imitation is a method for transmitting causally opaque technologies or conventional practices, customs, and languages, and if its function relies on the precise, detailed, high-fidelity transmission of those practices, then changing the details of the practice, as innovation necessarily would require, could undermine its function. And I think this is particularly obvious in the case of, say, ritual and custom, but I think it's also relevant for the other kinds of traditions that I have in mind. So just a sort of toy example for why this is the case, why imitation has to be conservative. So let's say that you're learning a custom, right? And let's say that you're learning that custom through imitation, and the custom is to take off your shoes before you enter a house. So you have a pupil or a novice and she watches a demonstrator that bends over and takes off her right shoe first, and then the left, and then places both shoes to the right of the door, let's say. Now, it might be that the exact details of the shoe removal procedure are completely irrelevant to the custom, but it might be that they're not, right? So either way, the possibility that the details of the procedure are not irrelevant to the custom should make it the case that in order to learn the custom, the novice should learn and replicate the behavior that she's seen fairly precisely, right? So she should bend over, remove the right shoe, and then the left, take both shoes and put them to the right of the door. Now, if the novice starts innovating, right, getting creative, starts playing with the procedure, playing around with the sequence of the action, then she risks undermining the custom. She risks undermining the tradition. That is, if it's required to place both shoes to the right of the door, but the novice decides to put one shoe to the right, one shoe to the left, then the custom hasn't been transmitted. The tradition hasn't been transmitted. Likewise, if one has to remove the right shoe before the left, and the novice decides to do it the other way around, then the tradition hasn't been transmitted. The point is that because it's not the causal or the environmental affordances that constrain the custom, but rather conventional and arbitrary, certainly from the point of view of getting your shoes off, then one simply cannot alter elements of the action procedure willy-nilly. Right? One must imitate faithfully and thus conservatively. That is, in order to transmit conventional traditions successfully, creativity must be resisted. Now, another example of this, if it's not totally obvious, but I'll just give a quick example, is complex skills with an opaque causal structure. So it's a little bit different here. So in terms of conventional behaviors, it seems like there just is no reconstruction possible from the perspective of sort of individual reasoning that's going to get you to understanding why it is that, without the demonstrator, right? Without the demonstrator understanding why the different pieces of the tradition are required. When it comes to complex skills, it just seems like this is often the most efficient strategy, right? So it's not that I want to claim that it's impossible to reconstruct the causal structure, but oftentimes it's very, very difficult. It might only be possible in retrospect. It might only be possible through reverse engineering. And so given that there are these practical challenges, it turns out that this is the most efficient strategy, right? So just taking on board exactly what has been done. And so this is an example that Nick Shea gives in a 2009 paper on imitation. He says, scientists generally copy all the details of a protocol. There may be no good reason for using 10 milliliters rather than 20, or 5 of some solvent, say. That may just be the way it was first done, and since it worked, no one has bothered to find out if the quantity could be varied. Indeed, some experiments are so tricky to get right that practitioners show an almost religious adherence to the letter of a known protocol. When an experiment takes hours or days to perform, there is very little motivation to put the result at risk in order to identify which steps or quantities are essential and which can be varied. So all sorts of techniques and steps are copied without any appreciation of whether or why they are necessary to achieve the goal. Following an experimental protocol can feel rather like following a magic spell. Now, when we're discussing complex skills, which include elements or subtasks that do not have their effects immediately, but rather many steps down the line, it seems likely that those effects are just not the kinds of things that could be identified or recognized in a straightforward manner by the observer. Accordingly, when complex tasks or skills have an opaque causal structure, their successful transmission requires, or this requires is not a necessity. It should lean towards a high degree of conservatism. The learner should perform each of the elements of the procedure faithfully, resisting modification despite not understanding the purpose of each individual step. Again, this isn't because omitting or modifying a step in the procedure this is because omitting or modifying a step in the procedure has the risk of undermining the successful transmission of the practice. Now, this isn't to say that no modification to the skill can ever be applied, but it is to just highlight that changes, additions, modifications, omissions have a cost, right? Accordingly, innovation cannot be produced blindly or randomly, but will require a certain degree of understanding. And this means that the replication of a technique or procedure conservatively is an efficient strategy for the transmission of a technology or skill that's complex, right? Complex enough to be the kind of thing that we're talking about with cumulative culture, that it can't be developed by a single individual or group in a single lifetime. And this means that innovation simply cannot remain unconstrained or ubiquitous. And I don't really want to talk about language, but it does seem that learning words, at least, is also importantly related to this sort of conservative imitation, right? That in order to learn a word properly, one needs to replicate faithfully and not simply innovate wherever one would like if one wants to learn the word. Now, one way of thinking about imitation and conservatism is from the perspective of perceived as opposed to actual relevance. So the way in which imitation works seems that it allows relevance to be determined by the model or by the demonstrator rather than grounding relevance in what appears relevant to the observer. That is, the demonstrator or the demonstration, depends on how you want to cash it out, becomes authoritative. And this seems critical for establishing faithful replication of the kinds of traditions that I have in mind, because apparent relevance or irrelevance is going to turn out to be an unreliable guide in these kinds of situations. Right, so much should be clear, since what's required for successfully using a tool with an opaque causal structure or repeating a conventional and thus causally arbitrary custom or practice will have little to do with the kinds of features that can be observed independently of the procedure or the custom modeled. Right? So the idea is that relevance in these cases cannot be observed through individual perceptual, causal, or logical reasoning. As such, in order to acquire complex tradition, the observer has to default to imitating precisely or repeating the behavior precisely, since, as I sort of am beating a dead horse, not imitating, not reproducing the behavior precisely, adding, omitting, modifying could undermine the transmission, the successful transmission of the tradition. So it should be clear that imitation must function to constrain the diversity of solutions, and as such, it must function conservatively. Now, if this is right, then accounting for innovation, for the possibility of creativity in cumulative culture, we need to have a substantive explanation. We simply cannot take it for free. Right, and explaining the innovation, I'm actually not going to go into the studies of innovation, but I hope that it's clear that explaining innovation of the kind that we're interested in for cumulative culture isn't simply going to be a matter of explaining sort of the contextual factors that promote or inhibit innovation. It's really going to be about explaining what kind of innovation is going to be compatible with with high-fidelity transmission of traditions in order to support and to support cumulative culture. Okay, so what I want to do then is to talk about innovation, and talk about how it is that we can innovate in the right way such that we don't undermine what we've gained with high-fidelity transmission, and we get the kind of improvements and modifications that we need to explain. So the way that I'll proceed is simply to follow Masudi et al., right? So they give a taxonomy of innovation kinds. And I'll look at the different kinds of innovation that they forward and think about which of these is going to be compatible with cumulative culture. And what we'll see is that at least 3 of these are not going to be compatible with cumulative culture, or they're not going to be the kinds of innovations that are going to be able to support cumulative culture. Meanwhile, the others are going to be compatible with cumulative culture. They're going to be able to give us the kind of innovation we need, but only if they're grounded in understanding. And I'm not going to say anything about breakthrough or insight because I think the category is largely mystical. And anyway, we can talk later in question and answer, but I won't say much at all about that. So, good. Why is it that chance and trial and error are incompatible with the kind of innovation that we need for cumulative culture? We'll call them cultural variations, right? The kinds of variations that aren't going to undermine the high-fidelity transmissions that we've seen as important in the previous section. Well, it seems that there's just no guarantee if we're working with chance, random exploration, accident, right? There's just no guarantee that the modifications that result from chance or trial and error learning will respect the integrity of a tradition in such a way that will ensure that the improvements and modifications of previous generations are retained in the current iteration of the practice. And clearly it just seems that this is because accident and copying error, sort of random exploration, aren't going to differentiate between the necessary and the incidental or the irrelevant aspects of a skill or norm in such a way that's going to ensure that only the features that wouldn't undermine the transmission of the tradition are changed or modified, while others remain fixed or the relevant ones get enhanced in a targeted fashion. But if chance and trial and error learning are largely responsible for the creativity, as I think they probably are, if they're responsible for the creativity in the non-human animal world, then it seems that we simply cannot generalize from the creativity that we see in non-human animals to the kind of innovation that we need for cumulative culture. And this is precisely because imitation as a high-fidelity mechanism underpinning cultural, normative, and linguistic transmissions has to stand in opposition to this kind of creativity of individual and trial and error learning, right? If you want to have the conservativeness, then you can't just have the random innovation happening that is going to be the sort of thing that happens as a result of chance or trial and error. And so we see that the kind of processes that we seek to account for need to be sort of both conservative and creative. And it's not the case that chance and trial and error give us the conservativeness, right? They just give us the creativity, but they don't have the capacity to differentiate in the right way to take on board the improvements and the modifications that we would need to from previous generations. Now, another kind of innovation that I'm going to call Refinement-A, that doesn't account for cumulative culture. It's not that it's incompatible with it. So it's a different problem here when we get to Refinement-A. It's just that it doesn't give us enough innovation, doesn't give us enough improvement or refinement. So what I have in mind here by this kind of refinement is a process through which an existing technique or skill is improved. And often that happens over time, right? It becomes more effective, it becomes more efficient. A lot of times that's through practice. And I think, so we can see this sort of in this silly example, right? So we can think about learning to fold a paper airplane. So we learn to fold a paper airplane, and we might refine that technique. So we'll get better at folding the sides accurately. We'll get better at getting the lines straight. But if we're only refining our existing technique, right, we're only going to produce a better version of the same plane, right? We're not going to produce a better plane, right? And it strikes me that this difference between producing a better version of the same plane and producing a better plane is important for us to appreciate if we want an account of cumulative culture, because it seems that for cumulative culture, we're largely interested in the kinds of improvements of the plane variety, not just the better version of the same kind of plane, right? We want to make progress. We don't want to simply do the same thing over and over again and refine our technique. We want to, in fact, make progress in creating better traditions, right? And it seems that just this kind of refinement isn't going to give us those kinds of innovations, and it's not going to be enough. Now, again, this isn't to say that this is incompatible with cumulative culture, but it is to say that we need something more, right? This isn't going to, on its own, give us the kind of innovations that we're interested in when it comes to cumulative culture. Now, what's striking about the remaining kinds of innovation, so we'll call it Refinement-B, which is modifying the technique, not just refining the execution of the technique, recombination, which is taking different parts, combining them, exaptation, taking one, say, a tool or a procedure in one scenario and using it for a different purpose. One of the things that's really interesting to notice is that if these are going to be effective and not collapse into trial and error learning or teaching, then they're going to be grounded in understanding. That is, if we're interested in accounting for innovation of the kind that's compatible with and supportive of cumulative culture, then that innovation must be intelligent, systematic, targeted, and precise. The right kind of innovation for a cumulative culture cannot be blind or random. So let's just see what kind of understanding we're talking about, what kind of understanding we need for these kinds of innovation. So it seems to me that at the very least, for refinement of the modifying an existing technique and recombination of existing elements into new variants, at the very least, we'll need to differentiate between the relevant and irrelevant features of a task or a procedure. And it's precisely for the reasons that I've sort of been going on about, that without this kind of understanding, we don't get the kind of conservatism that we need that's required for successfully transmitting a tradition. So if one's going to modify or recombine existing elements and one isn't going to go about the modification or recombination in a sort of random trial and error way, then we have to be aware of which elements can be recombined and modified, and in which ways they can be recombined and modified. And this is going to require, at the very least, differentiating between those aspects or elements of a tradition that are required and those that are not, those that are relevant and those that aren't relevant. So to modify and recombine in a targeted and controlled manner, what my claim is that an agent has to understand what can and can't be modified. So otherwise, as I said, we're confronted with the same problem that we had with trial and error learning and with chance, that we cannot ensure that we cannot ensure the high fidelity transmission of the tradition. Now, for exaptation, it seems to me that we need a slightly different kind of understanding. So if we're going to apply an existing technology to a new function, it seems that we not only have to understand which aspects or which elements in a procedure are required or relevant and which irrelevant, we also need to understand why certain features of a technique are relevant. And so just again, to take sort of a toy example, we can think about something like using a hammer as a doorstop, right? So you might be able to figure that out by trial and error, but there's a sense in which if you want to figure that out in a way that that isn't simply about trial and error, right, that's going to be compatible with the kinds of things that I've been saying, then we need to know certain things about which features of that tool are relevant for its function, right? So we'd want to know about, say, the distribution of the weight. We'd want to know about the shape, right? What it is that these variables contribute to how it is that that tool works, so that you could then use that tool to do various things. So only if we understand how it is that the features contribute to the function will we be able to intelligently apply a new function to the existing artifact. And so it seems that at the very least, for the innovations that we're interested in giving an account of that are compatible with cumulative culture, we have at least these two different kinds of understanding that are required. Distinguishing relevant and irrelevant elements of a procedure or a technique, and then going a little bit further, understanding why the elements or the aspects of a technique or task are relevant. So in this last section, what I'll do is talk about technique-centered teaching. And I'll claim that technique-centered teaching can deliver the kind of understanding that we need in order to innovate in the kinds of ways that are compatible and supportive of cumulative culture. So more specifically, technique-centered teaching, by transferring information about the technique itself, has the capacity to highlight important features about the means by which a goal is achieved, and this leads to the understanding that can produce and support cultural innovation. Now, when I talk about technique-centered, I don't know if I want to go into the detail about this. Okay, so broadly, what I'll have in mind for technique-centered teaching is any kind of teaching that aims to facilitate learning in a pupil by focusing on the means, strategy, or technique by which the task, practice, or tradition is performed. So this is really you don't have to worry about the previous definition. This is the definition of teaching that I have in mind. And it's really the last part, D, by focusing on the means, strategy, or technique of a practice that is meant to sort of tie in to the arguments that I gave earlier about imitation and the technique-centered orientation. Okay, so how is it that we're going to get from this kind of teaching that's focused on technique to understanding. Now, one obvious benefit, I think, in using technique-centered teaching is that we can directly teach a technique itself, right? So this is exactly what's often been claimed, right? That teaching is a method or a mechanism by which we can transmit in a high-fidelity way traditions. Now, importantly, if we're going to teach a technique or a procedure effectively, it seems that at the very least, what we're going to want to do is at least to highlight which parts of the technique are important and which are incidental, right? So to effectively transmit the skill or the knowledge in the first place in a way that focuses not only on the goal, but on the way in which those goals are achieved, we should seek to demonstrate those aspects of a technique that are most relevant for achieving the goal. And not incidentally, it seems that this is indeed the way that we teach small children various skills and practices. So using demonstration, we emphasize those aspects of a procedure that are most important by exaggerating them in gesture and using ostensive cues, eye contact, and other ways of drawing a pupil's attention to the exaggerated elements of a demonstrated technique. And so we communicate which elements or features of a technique matter most doing this. I'd say, I don't want to say it's burgeoning, but it's developing literature on something called motionese, right? And this is exactly what we see in motionese, that in teaching, in the way that adults and children interact, often through demonstration, what we do, and this is very natural, right? If you want to teach someone something without explaining it to them, you exaggerate, right? You take this like this, right? And you exaggerate your gestures. What's nice about this is that if we want an evolutionary explanation, we can see that this sort of demonstration precedes any requirement for linguistic competence. But what's most important, I think, for my purposes here, is that emphasizing or exaggerating the important or the central or the most relevant aspects of a technique or a strategy transmits more than simply the behavior, right? It also transmits an understanding. Right? The teaching of this sort fosters an understanding of relevance and contingency. And importantly, this understanding can ground the sort of refinement, modification refinement, recombination that's required for cultural innovation. Since in understanding which elements of a procedure are relevant, a student is then able to go on to modify and recombine in ways that aren't simply going to be trial and error, that are going to be precise, intelligent, and targeted. So we can enhance those aspects of a procedure that have been shown to us as being important, and we can keep fixed those elements that are required and do what we want with the others. So the point is that by using technique-centered teaching, we're in a unique position to account for cultural innovation, since we're essentially promoting not only the high-fidelity transmission of a tradition, but an understanding of the technique. And so in this way, technique-centered teaching can free up an individual to modify, combine, and recombine elements or features of a tradition intelligently. Now, of course, if we add explanation to this, right, if we add language, if we add linguistic capacity to this, it seems that we expand our possibilities significantly. So we can explain not simply by demonstration, but we can explain, for instance, how various elements, through language, we can explain how various elements, say, of a procedure are related to one another. We can explain what contribution individual elements make to an overall skill or technology. We can teach how various elements behave in similar circumstances or in other kinds of contexts, how they're related to other techniques, other practices. We can identify their causal role, explain their social significance, isolate where they belong in a theoretical framework, and so on. I think this obviously entails sort of the powerful opportunities for innovation, since we, at this point, have the power to predict and to determine more precisely how it is that various kinds of modifications will affect a transmitted tradition. And it might be that this deeper kind of understanding is required, as I had suggested, for exaptation, and maybe breakthrough, whatever breakthrough happens to be. Just to note, and I'll finish up just around now, that no other kind of teaching is going to deliver this kind of understanding. So I'm not going to go through the taxonomy of various teaching kinds, but it's important to see that no other form of teaching puts technique or means on center stage. And if determining relevance requires consideration of the technique, as I've argued, because that technique allows us to see what's relevant and what's irrelevant, or it allows us to see why a certain aspect of the technique or what a certain element of the technique is relevant or irrelevant, then no other kind of teaching is going to give us the kind of innovation. No other kind of teaching is going to guarantee the kind of innovation that we need for cumulative culture. That is, at the very least, an understanding of relevance is required for innovation of the kind that support cumulative culture, and relevance and irrelevance are features of the precise means or technique by which a task or tradition is instantiated. Then teaching that does not focus on means cannot foster understanding of relevance. That's the idea. And teaching that's not technique-centered isn't going to be able to support the kind of intelligent, precise, targeted, and controlled innovation that we need for cumulative culture. Now, there's a really nice bonus about, huge things about human evolution, but I guess I'll just say that if you buy my story, then you can explain why there's a huge lull in innovation in the human evolutionary record, where you have basically 300,000 years, some say close to 1 million, of relatively little innovation, but high fidelity transmission. And that's because if you think of imitation and teaching as two different mechanisms, and you think of one as developing prior to the other, then what you should expect is that a culture or a population that imitates but doesn't teach, right, wouldn't have the kind of innovation that I'm claiming that technique-centered teaching allows or promotes. Right? We would just have sort of a conservative, precise kind of transmission without innovation. And it does seem that that's what was the case for at least a few 100,000 years. Okay, thanks.